The wind comes first, always the wind. It hisses through dry grass and rattles loose boards on a half-finished shack, carrying dust, whispers, and the echo of footsteps belonging to people who believed this empty horizon could change their lives. Long before Hollywood, before dime novels and cowboy posters, this harsh, sprawling land we now call the Wild West was not a myth but a living, breathing frontier full of danger, hope, and contradiction. Imagine the American continent in the early 1800s, the eastern cities humming with factories, immigrants crowding the docks, and politicians in polished boots arguing in marble halls, while far to the west, beyond the Mississippi River, lay a world most citizens would never see in their lifetime, a world mapped by rumor, stories, and the fading ink of explorers' journals. Out there, the line between sky and earth blurred. The land was so wide, so raw, that it seemed to swallow people whole or remake them entirely. Native nations had called these lands home for thousands of years. Plains horsemen following buffalo herds, southwestern farmers coaxing life from desert soil, coastal tribes fishing oceans and rivers rich with food. Each nation had its own laws, stories, and boundaries, none of which were drawn on the maps back east. To the people who already lived here, the West was not wild at all. It was home, full of meaning, sacred places, trade routes, and history. But to the rising United States, hungry for land, resources, and power, this home was an open frontier waiting to be claimed. The story of the real Wild West begins with that collision between myth and reality, between a nation expanding and the people standing in its path, between dreams of opportunity and the brutal cost of empire. Picture a lone boat drifting down the muddy Mississippi in the early morning fog, piled high with furs, tools, and barrels of flour, guided by men whose hands are blistered from rowing and whose minds are set on profit. These are traders and trappers, among the first wave of American newcomers into the frontier. They follow the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, whose famous expedition in the early 1800s traced rivers from the Midwest all the way to the Pacific Ocean, turning rumors of mountain ranges and distant oceans into something the government could measure, claim, and plan to control. For many in the East, their journals read like adventure novels, towering mountains, strange animals, powerful indigenous nations, and landscapes so vast they seemed almost supernatural. Those tales sparked a fire. If this land was real, if it could be reached, then maybe it could also be owned. Soon wagon wheels carved trails through tall grass and across rocky plains. Families sold everything they had, small farms, shops, even heirloom furniture to buy oxen, rifles, flour, and just enough hope to carry them westward. They weren't all rugged cowboys in wide-brim hats. Most were exhausted parents, scared children, and anxious. Young adults, their eyes fixed on the promise of cheap land in places they couldn't even pronounce. Yet, Oregon, California, Texas, the Oregon Trail became a river of humanity flowing inexorably toward the unknown. But this journey was no movie montage. It was cholera, scurvy, broken wagon axles, and cold nights listening to wolves howl across the prairies. It was burying a loved one in a shallow grave under a lone tree and then being forced to move on the next morning because the wagon train couldn't stop for grief. It was meeting native nations, sometimes trading, sometimes sharing fires and stories, and sometimes facing conflict and fear, born from misunderstanding and desperation. Every mile west stretched, the gap between the dream sold in newspapers and the reality under travelers' blistered feet. At the same time, another force reshaped the West: gold. In 1848, when gold was discovered in California, the news raced across the country faster than any wagon could move, carried by letters, newspapers, and wild rumors. "Gold in the American River," they cried. "You can scoop it up by the handful." Suddenly, men who had never left their home state were staring at maps, calculating risks and imagining themselves rich beyond their wildest hopes. Ships filled with fortune hunters set sail around South America or cut across to Panama, then raced up the Pacific coast. Others slammed wheels onto dirt and pushed west by wagon, on foot or even alone on horseback. Boomtowns exploded from nothing in a matter of months. Clusters of tents became muddy streets, then rough-hewn saloons, gambling halls, and supply shops where prices soared with every new arrival. These early mining camps were loud, desperate, and often terrifying. There were no police forces at first, no established courts, no solid government presence, just miners, entrepreneurs, gamblers, outlaws, and a handful of people trying to bring some kind of order. Gold dust changed hands over poker tables. Violence erupted over claims, and fortunes were made and lost overnight. Yet even here in the chaos and greed, some found community, partnerships, and lifelong friendships forged in sweat and hardship. Behind the rush of gold and land, the U.S. government worked quietly, persistently, and often ruthlessly. Treaties were signed with native nations, promising peace, land, and protection, but those promises were broken again and again as more settlers demanded land and access to resources. Military forts rose along trails and in contested territories, symbols of a growing federal presence, determined to secure the frontier for American expansion. The West was not just a story of rugged individuals. It was also a story of policy and power, of soldiers and surveyors, of railroad tycoons and politicians making deals that would reshape the map. And in the middle of it all were people who had no say in these decisions. Indigenous families forced onto reservations, Mexican communities disrupted by shifting borders after the U.S.-Mexican War, Chinese laborers facing brutal discrimination while building the railroads, Black cowboys and soldiers seeking opportunity and dignity in a country that still refused to fully acknowledge their humanity. When you picture the real Wild West, don't just imagine a lone cowboy under a blazing sky. Imagine crowded wagon trains, busy mining camps, soldiers marching, native leaders arguing for their people's survival, and railroad workers hammering spikes into the earth as iron rails stretched toward the horizon. The frontier was a living crossroads of cultures, languages, and clashing visions of the future. Through dust storms and blizzards, across deserts and mountain passes, the West became a vast stage where bravery and cruelty, generosity and betrayal, hope and heartbreak played out in equal measure. In this documentary, we're not just chasing legends. We're peeling them back to see the real people behind them. The ones who built towns from nothing, who lost everything, who negotiated peace or waged war, who loved, prayed, laughed, and cried in a land that could be both beautiful and unforgiving. If you've ever wondered what really happened out here, how the cowboy myth was born, what life was actually like in a frontier town, and how the expansion of the United States reshaped entire civilizations, then you're in the right place. Stay with us as we ride deeper into this story, follow the trails, and listen to voices that history books often reduce to footnotes. And before we continue, if you're fascinated by this journey already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because in the next chapter, we'll step right into the dusty streets of those legendary frontier towns, meet the real cowboys and lawmen, and uncover the truth behind the Wild West you think you know. Your support helps us keep bringing hidden history to life, one story at a time.